as we're reading the Old Testament, the first prophet we hit is this 66 behemoth, Isaiah. What is the significance of that book and that prophet?
Yeah, Isaiah is a huge significance both in Jewish circles and in Christian. So even let's start with the Christian in a sense, because it's one of the most quoted books of the New Testament, along with Deuteronomy and Psalms. So Isaiah really, it has a lot of themes that are picked up in the New Testament. Lots of different messages, but. So okay, let me just kind of get into Isaiah. It's a complicated book, but there's a way of breaking it down that I think is helpful. Not everyone agrees, but I think it helps us a little bit. So Isaiah 1 to 39, if you can think of that section as PreExilic, so before the exile, there's this message of those messages of judgment where if you repent or things of change, this is what needs to get done. And then you get this other section from 40 to 55 where it seems that they are in exile. And the words there are mostly about comfort. It's about restoration. It's about finding your way back to the land. And then 56 to 66 seems to be post-exilic. So a mix of both the judgment and the restoration pieces together. And it's a good way of seeing 1st, 2nd, 3rd Isaiah in terms of the entire scope of things. That it's the judgment message or the messages of judgment that's before, because it's warning. Like if you continue on doing these horrific things, this is what will happen to you. But then when you are actually in it and everything's been destroyed, there's this message of hope, restoration, even this new exodus coming back into the land. And then after with this post-exilic, now how do you make sense of everything that has happened to you? So Isaiah is one of those books that kind of have this long, quite big, expansive outlook to Israel.
So we have hope and restoration as primary themes. What about this suffering servant theme? Anybody who reads Isaiah is going to see this suffering servant, and we don't always know what to do with that image. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the things that happens in Isaiah are these poems of this servant. The servant of the Lord. We're not sure exactly who this is, but it could be different for different poems. So one of them, it is Cyrus. He's the king of Persia, who brings back the Israelites out of exile. So he's there, but also it seems like there's this kind of ambiguity to this identity of this servant, especially Isaiah 53. You get this suffering servant, which the New Testament kind of picks up in certain places, again with Jesus, but sometimes, so another way of reading the suffering servant is Israel. Israel who serves and in a way has suffered, but brings about salvation in that. It's a key theme in Isaiah. Lots of articles, lots of things written about the suffering servant and trying to find the identity of this person.
What are some of the ways that the suffering servant or the servant figure or figures suffer? Like, what are some commonalities among them?
So I'm primarily looking at Isaiah 53, but yeah, they're disfigured, beaten, tortured, wounded. By his stripes we are healed. So it's vicarious suffering. There's a healing that happens for maybe the nations, for Israel through this suffering servant. So in suffering, there's this hope that happens. But again, I guess if you read the New Testament, you could see where it all points to Jesus.
Right.
But as if you're just limited to the Old Testament, you could kind of identify with the anguish of what Israel's going through with exile, even after the exile, and they're back. It's not glorious the way they thought it would be in any kind of way. And the neighboring people, they're mocked.
Yes.
So they're, again, it's really getting beat up. And to be honest, Israel would be a laughing stock among the nations.
Right.
And you get this with other minor prophets, but that's why they're also judged. It's when Israel needed help, when the Assyrians or the Babylonians are attacking, all their neighbors have abandoned them. They've actually joined in looting them. And again, you can see some of that, the aspects of suffering and how that works.
Right. And certainly the prophets knew what suffering was. Many times they were sufferers themselves. But sometimes there's a role reversal. And in Isaiah, we see him taking a mocking attitude. Why does he mock? Why does Isaiah mock?
Oh, yeah. I think what you're talking about is mocking the idols.
Yes.
So early on, there's this really interesting picture of idolatry, which I think is key. So Isaiah has these really vibrant and big pictures of that help us explain a lot of things. And idolatry is one of them. And he just mocks idols in general. Like you take a piece of log, you cut it in half. Out of one half, you make an idol. The other half, you create a fire and you eat with it. And you bow down to one and the other one's used. But what's interesting about how Isaiah talks about idols too is kind of some of the things that get picked up, I think, in the New Testament and other places.
Right.
Idols, when you worship an idol, they are blind. They can't see, they can't talk, they can't hear, they can't walk, they're lame. This is how he explains it. It's the same thing a little bit of some of the reasons why certain miracles happen maybe in the New Testament. Blindness, muteness, deafness, lameness, is Israel is kind of in a state, and this is probably some of the things that are happening, is in the state of who they're worshiping. So you become kind of what you worship. It's an interesting idea and thought, but the prophets are all about kind of pushing that boundary a little bit, and it's the same things that Israel will suffer, and that's why the whole spiritual blindness and all those other aspects and listening to God, they pop up again, because again, their sin is idolatry, worshiping these pieces of wood that can't do and aren't alive.
So Kyung, can you give us one key to reading in and interpreting Isaiah?
Oh boy. So the prophetic books are not easy to read. I would recommend reading them with some type of help, with commentary. Maybe even the Bible Project, which I've mentioned before, at least gives you an introduction to the whole before you dive into the pieces. I think the danger of reading the prophetic books is we like to take certain verses because they sound so good.
Yes.
And Isaiah's full of them, actually. So you have to make sure you're reading them kind of in context. Read the whole and then try to figure out parts of it and then the implications of those parts.